Okay, that's us at 3 minutes past. So I'm going to get started. It's so lovely seeing all your names in the attendees list. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us this afternoon. And welcome to our webinar today, where we're discussing the cost of not doing discovery. We're super excited to have you all here. My name's Emily Horgan, and I'm the capability lead for the experience design team in Sopra Steria. And I'm delighted to be facilitating today's session for you. So before we get formally started, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. So first off, we will be recording this session. However, we can't see you or hear you as attendees, so don't worry about muting yourself or switching your camera off. There's also an option down the left-hand side of your screen for closed captioning if you need it. And the way that we're structuring today is that there'll be a discussion with the panelists, and then there'll be about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So the way that we're collecting questions is using the Q&A feature in Slido. So you can contribute questions and also use the upvote feature for questions that have already been contributed to vote them to the top. So without further ado, we're going to get started on today's exciting topic. So the need for confident, evidence-based decision-making has never been more pressing. We're working in an era of intense complexity that requires us to find balance in contradictions. So balancing AI with human-centeredness, being intentional, but delivering at pace. And often organizations find themselves really eager to plunge headfirst into the doing, bypassing the essential step of asking, who are we doing this for and why? Can we do this? And more importantly, should we do this? So today, we will be reflecting on what happens when we sideline the crucial process of deeply understanding the who, the why, and the impact of our work, not only on the success of a service, but also on the reputation of organizations, the morale of our teams, and the welfare of those we serve. I'm so thrilled to be joined today by a panel of industry experts and thought leaders in the fields of product management, service design, and experience design. So we've got a blended panel today from both Sopra Steria and CX Partners. Sopra Steria are a European organization recognized for human-centered consulting, digital services, and software development. And CX Partners are part of the Sopra Steria family and are a service design agency centered on improving services through human-centered design. We'll explore the real cost of not doing a discovery and how we as practitioners can highlight this in a productive way that leads to real change. And by the end of our session today, you'll have a view of some key tangible and intangible costs associated with neglecting this critical discovery phase. So we invite you to participate actively, engage with our speakers through that Slido Q&A, and emerge from this session empowered to advocate for human-centered discoveries within your own team and organization. So let's meet our panel. For each panel member, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, your role and organization, and finish the sentence, "To me, discovery is." So if we could start with yourself, Caroline, that'd be great.
Lovely, thanks very much, Emily, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So my name is Caroline Gibson. I am the delivery lead for experience design at Sopra Steria, and to me, a discovery is a really sensible and a really valuable thing to do if you're thinking about investing in new technologies to either design or change your service. Because discoveries really do help you make informed decisions about where to spend your money.
Thank you, Caroline. Fionn, I'm going to come to you next.
Sure, thanks, Emily. So my name is Fionn Tynan-O'Mahony, and I lead the engagement of our experience design capability in Sopra Steria, primarily focused on the government sector. This means I work closely with clients right at the beginning of projects, understanding their needs and helping shape human-centered approaches to meet those needs. For me, discovery is a critical opportunity to make a conscious decision about whose voice you're including and whose voice you're excluding from your strategic decision-making.
So much, Fionn. Nicola, over to you.
Great, thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. I'm Nicola. I'm a principal service designer within the public services team at CX Partners. I've been at CX for 2 years, but I've been in the industry for 12, and I've held roles in marketing, user research, and social impact strategy. So I wear those various hats and bring them into my role as service designer today. And to me, discovery is really about shaking out what we think to be true so that we focus our energy in all the right places.
Thank you. And last but not least, Steve.
Thanks, Emily. Hey, everyone. So I'm Steve Cable, and I'm an experience design director at CX Partners. And to me, discovery is just the best way to identify opportunities, whether that's opportunities to improve people's lives or opportunities to improve your business or your organization.
Thank you. So it's so great to have you all today, and super interesting to hear what discovery means to you all individually. But I'm wondering, for us to move forward, whether it's worth getting a bit more specific on what we collectively mean when we say discovery. So for a kickoff question, I was wondering whether the panel would be willing to discuss what we mean when we say discovery, and what are we talking about when we say the word discovery?
Yeah, I'll start you off there, Emily. So discovery is often spoken about in the context of the agile delivery life cycles. You might have heard it in the terms of the various project phases, so discovery, alpha and beta. The discovery is really like that initial phase where we really explore and define the problem space. And it's a time at which we really challenge our own assumptions on that problem space. So it's a period where we do a lot of research, it's a period where we do a lot of evidence gathering. So we're really understanding who our users are, what their needs are, what their challenges are, what their constraints are, what's the landscape that they're operating within. And you should really end your discovery with a really sort of clear evidence-based view of what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, and potentially if it's worth your investment.
I was gonna jump in and say that, specifically within government as well, it has some very specific meanings, but I think, Caroline, you've covered a lot of it. Within government, it is part of that agile delivery framework, as that discovery alpha beta life cycle that Caroline spoke about. But really it's a necessary step within that phase. And it's a phase that you need to evidence your understanding before you commit to building a service, really understanding, as Caroline said, your users and the things they're trying to achieve, understanding any major constraints that you have in your system, like it could be technology, it could be policy constraints, it could be fiscal constraints, and then also really connecting that with the underlying policy intent. What are we trying to achieve through the policy that has been set out, and how will that be manifested in a service? So those, from a government side, those are things that you really need to get through this phase and be able to evidence.
And just to add what Fionn said there, I think it's also about establishing the kinds of research activities, whether it's building on existing research that you've done and the evidence that you've got internally and the data you've got, stakeholder research, user research, but all of that with an eye on what's kind of meaningful and proportionate to the scale of the challenge that you're trying to solve, and whether you're looking at that at a kind of product level, a service level, or even an organizational or system level.
And yeah, I suppose to build on that, Nicola, is that if you're trying to figure out what your proportionate and appropriate discovery activities are, it's really about understanding what questions you need to answer with that. And I think whenever I'm thinking about planning discoveries, it's about asking the questions of, for this product to be successful or for this service to be successful, what needs to be true? Figuring out what those questions might be, and then, okay, well, what do we do to answer those questions? Is it some qualitative interviews? Is it, is it something more quantitative? Is it, it's basically start leading with your questions and the things that are known unknowns.
It's interesting hearing you all kind of describe and define and align on that discovery definition, and it makes me wonder why someone wouldn't want to do a discovery. So I'm going to ask specific members on the panel some questions around that just now. So Steve, given your position as Director of Experience Design, I'm sure you have lots of interesting conversations with stakeholders and organizations around their thought process as to why they might or might not engage in a discovery. So I was wondering if you could maybe share some insight into the key things that are blockers to teams engaging with discoveries.
Yeah, sure. So the common things, when we're kind of writing proposals and trying to sell work that includes discovery is questions about money and time, essentially. The questions like, why does it take this long, and do we really have to spend this much on this? And I think what that comes down to really is the fact that the inherent value of doing a discovery isn't kind of immediate. There's no kind of immediate return on investment. It's like if you compare it to, let's say, I want to do a short piece of research to optimize an existing process, right? You do that user testing, you find some quick fixes, and within a month you're seeing, let's say, on a checkout journey, you're seeing an increasing conversion. You've got more money coming in. Whereas if it's like a big discovery at the start of the project, there's none of that instant return on investment. And when they've got a budget that they need to spend and they've got a product that they need to deliver, it's like, okay, well, we could do this discovery, but I've got this deadline coming up and I've got this big list of features that have been promised. Why don't we just start working on that right away? Is this not just going to slow us down and cost us more? But actually, when we've seen projects that haven't done discoveries and taken that time to figure out, you see actually the opposite is true, right? By doing this kind of thinking and evidence-based discovery up front, you actually end up speeding up delivery because you make decisions far more quickly because there's less opinions and more kind of stuff like that. Fionn, you got your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna relay the order that I wanted to speak. No, I think that point you're making as well is that like that need to deliver against products or deadlines or budgets that people have, I think is really important, and I think we need to empathize with colleagues and clients in those positions where often I think that the point at which a discovery becomes present or about to happen is generally quite a long time after the initial conversations about why something might need to have happened. Maybe it's gone through multiple cycles of business cases. People have secured budget, have defined a timeline, have maybe baked some kind of aspiration into that year's results in whether that's financial or cost saving or something. And I think that starts to drive those questions. And I think recognizing that those challenges exist, but actually still, even then, if those things are baked in, skipping a discovery is not necessarily a positive thing to do, even within those constraints that are there.
I think I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Caroline, because, as product managers worked across tons of projects, that discussion around scoping, setting out those objectives like Fionn mentioned, and like balancing that with cost and time is something I'd imagine you've had conversations about like day in, day out. So could you maybe give us a sense of like what we mean by cost in those conversations, like what comes across and what's considered a cost, like in those early discussions around discoveries?
Yeah, sure. So you're bang on, the money, scope and cost go hand in hand and can have like a really significant impact on each other. So I'll probably start with scope and then come on to the cost piece. But like when it comes to scope, like we're always at risk of going too broad with our scope or too narrow. So it's really important to have like a really tight, clear scope that everyone's aligned around. If you go too broad with your scope in a discovery, like you just might not get under the skin of the issue, you might not cut to the heart of what like really needs to be done. You might not even get to the point of exploring some of like the complexities that your users are experiencing or facing into in their journey. And equally, if you go too narrow, there's a real risk that you spend potentially like a disproportionate amount of time on a certain area of the problem, but you're not actually adding any value or sort of like improving your impact in that space. So it's a really sort of, it's a difficult thing to do, but you really need to balance sort of like the breadth and depth of your scope when you're defining a discovery. And then like on top of that, when you are in discovery mode, it's so important to sort of like continually revisit and reflect on that scope and to sort of like, like challenge yourself and the team to ask yourself the questions in the same way that Steve was asking him questions at the start. When we're in this project, we should be saying like, are the things that we are doing going to achieve the outcome that we're after here? Or do we need to pivot and do something differently? Do we need to course correct ourselves? And that's one of the real benefits of discovery, is you'll find out about these things like quite early on in the project life cycle, and that in itself has that knock-on impact on cost. But I guess like there's other cost benefits to discovery as well, like particularly because it's grounded in research, it's grounded in evidence. So like because it's an evidence-based approach, you can have more confidence in your decision making. So when it comes to potentially making like a really significant investment in technology, you've got a really like thorough rationale behind that decision making. So yes, it's an upfront cost, but it's one that plays like a really important role in almost sort of like managing that cost risk exposure throughout the whole project.
I wonder, like, as well, like the thing that keeps coming into my mind as well is, and I just like noticed Rachel's kind of touched on it in her question on the Slido, was just about the bias cost. You know, sometimes we've got such a strong decision that needs to be made, or there's such a strong vision of what people just want to skip a discovery and go straight to it, or maybe to use the discovery to validate ideas. But ends up what can end up happening is we just bias towards a certain audience, and we don't check our assumptions right at the door. And I guess one thing that like keeps coming to my mind is this. There's a quote in the book by Sasha Constanta-Chock, who wrote Design Justice, Community-Led Practices that Build the Worlds We Need. And she talks about like how even modern ways of working, you know, doing things that are evidence-based potentially, like A/B testing, can further bias something. So we can talk about, like, you know, say we leaned in without a discovery and we started building something, but actually because of the audience that we're building it for, we've not made some decisions or assumptions. We've made some assumptions about the people that we're building for, and we've privileged certain people, and then we continue to bias that through the reinforcing factors of methods like A/B testing or quantitative analysis, where we're seeing that it's only a small minority that may have an issue with that, and the majority seem to have a positive response, but actually we don't yet know at that point who is being affected. And I think that for me is a big cost of discovery, is that the cost is potentially furthering any systemic prejudice or institutional racism through those kind of unconscious acts at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And whenever I hear that kind of like consequence scanning, like understanding impact, it just immediately makes me think of impact mapping, which I know, Nicola, you have a ton of experience in. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a bit around the role of impact mapping in general, but specifically in those early stages in a discovery, and how that can help potentially mitigate some of those costs that we're talking about and that Fionn was highlighting.
Sure. Yeah, I think what Fionn was saying was really interesting, and kind of ensuring that in those early stages you're balancing, exploring both the potential harms and making sure that you are being inclusive in terms of who you're involving in understanding that, but also setting really clear intent around the value that you want to achieve. And I think that comes back to what Caroline was saying around really defining that value, being clear on what that value is, and how and being clear on what you're delivering, how what you're delivering is laddering up to the organizations or the sector's medium and longer term objectives and outcomes. And in particular, I think it's kind of, we talk about the kind of the murky middle, that often organizations will have quite a lot of clarity around their long-term outcomes or the long-term impact they aim to achieve. And they'll have quite a lot of clarity around what immediate impact they hope to do through their programs and services. But often there's a disconnect between how those things come together and what kinds of medium-term outcomes you might see out of the back of that. So impact mapping is a really useful tool and process for establishing that intent and building that alignment within the team around what is it that we're aiming to achieve, how do we think that a change will happen, what are our assumptions based on. And I think in going through that, the kind of the process is as valuable as the kind of the visual map output that comes out of it, because you're generally airing different perspectives on how you think change happens. You're exploring both, as we were talking about earlier, not just your positive intent, but checking yourselves against what the potential harms might be through consequence scanning. And so I think it's a really useful way of shaking out how our perspectives differ and kind of spotting those gaps in how we think things are likely to play out, and kind of working out where we have strong evidence to support our assumptions and where we don't. And that can be a really useful guide for where the discovery can take your work next.
That makes me think of a question there then, Nicola, of like, so when would you typically do that impact mapping? Does it start off as a kind of assumption exercise and then you figure out where your assumptions are and then you know what discovery you need to do, or does it happen after you've kind of gathered a load of evidence and you can do a more accurate mapping?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, I think it relates to a question in the chat around from Bathia around something called pre-discovery. And actually, I think we should talk about that, because I don't know if I'm totally clear on what that would involve, but I think actually impact mapping could be something that you would involve before you even start a discovery. It would be a way of getting those assumptions out there as early as you possibly can, establishing that intent on what you think what kind of long-term goal you're trying to achieve. And then as you move through discovery, as you move through alphas and so on, that picture should become clearer and clearer, and the evidence should become stronger. And if it's not, then that's where you'll be either validating or invalidating your assumptions around how change is happening. And just having that unifying kind of single source of truth can help you identify where you might need to pivot and focus more attention.
I think it sounds like it really, because I think the key thing in that pre-discovery space is about stakeholder alignment. And we talk about governance and corporates, but realistically, we're working in complex organizations where lots of people have different opinions of the same thing. And I think like an exercise like impact mapping or what can be a pre-discovery is really important to be able to bring people together around a shared problem or a shared opportunity and focus the attention on the outcomes that we're trying to get to. Because if that isn't done in discovery, it can be really messy and difficult to manage.
Yeah, and sometimes you find in the pre-discovery land, like the problem space is quite complex and there's perhaps a number of different discoveries within that. So it can be a really useful exercise to go through to get to grips with all the different problems or challenges that your users could be facing. And again, yeah, do that stakeholder alignment, do that prioritization, and understand where you'll target your energies in the first instance.
I think it's really interesting that we've covered off, like that cost of discovery and the value of discoveries to stakeholders, and also looking about that impact on the people that we serve, the people using the services that we're creating. But I wonder if we could have some reflection, and Fionn, I'm going to pick on you if that's okay, around what it means for our colleagues, for our teams, for practitioners who work on either delivering discoveries or maybe delivering services that haven't been rooted from discovery. Could you maybe tell us a bit about the impact that has on individuals within design teams or within wider multidisciplinary teams?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think if I'll probably start with the first. I'll start with the latter, with the impact of not having it and on the teams. And I think it's probably stuff that we've possibly talked about in context, but I know that our teams have had numerous instances of being on projects where actually the requirements are really set very firmly from the tender. It's a fixed price project that we're delivering, and I appreciate that government colleagues on this might have a different perspective on this, but sometimes you go into this where you're contractually you have to deliver something very specific, but actually those requirements are lacking a huge amount of context, and so when it comes to delivering something against those requirements, it can be really vague as to what to do. And so I've seen people spin on those questions and having to kind of divert back to do a discovery to do something afterwards, just to give that organization or that human context to why that requirement is needed and what benefit it will add, so that the designer can make an appropriate decision. Or I've seen it when it happens where people design something, but actually they're designing off kind of best practice or what they understand to be best practice. They'll push it forward, and someone senior will have a disagreement with it, or a developer will disagree with that implementation, and there's no anchoring there's no center point of like why this is a good decision. And I think having the lack of that foundation of a discovery and that evidence driven from that point makes it very hard to have objective discussions about like what the best thing to move forward would be, and depending as well on how well you're set up in terms of your testing cycles, etc. If that stuff is there to support that decision. But so I think realistically, it becomes a bit demoralizing and disempowering for the team delivering that and designing against those kind of projects and those services, because often it can be subject to opinion rather than evidence. It can waste a lot of time in decision making, prioritizing things rather than just quickly moving through because you know where your anchor point is. And I think I really think it can affect the overall morale of a team, because again it can't always connect with the meaning or purpose of what you're doing. That's, I guess, like the cost of not doing that discovery, or how that feels like in purpose. But I think the other side, like a discovery space, if you're doing discoveries quite consistently in a row, it can be quite taxing. They can be quite hard. You're jumping in often into a new organizational space or a new context space, a new subject matter, and you're really, I think, as a practitioner, you're really practicing those skills of empathy and stuff that you want to understand the context and want to drive meaningful change. So you're giving a lot of yourself into those spaces, and they can be quite intense 8 to 10 week projects, or even shorter sometimes. And at the end, you're kind of leading towards quite a critical decision. So backing those up, projects after project after project can really, I think, pull on burning the candles at both ends for people, and can lead to burnout, and something we need to kind of factor in and manage when we're resourcing teams.
To build on that, Fionn, I also think there's, particularly for stakeholders within organizations that have maybe been involved in certain dysfunctions, or I guess depending on what the triggers were for actually starting a discovery in the first place. But generally, if problems are building up over time, a discovery can be quite a cathartic experience as well, because you're airing a lot of those frustrations. You're getting kind of that visibility of the shared problem, which can be a really good, healthy thing in order to then be able to, as an organization, move on from those problems and say, okay, we can see what challenges we have here, and let's now focus our energy in more positive space.
I think that catharsis is I've seen that a lot, Nicola. Like, it's amazing when you talk to people on the phones in organizations and you find out how they've been complaining about all these user issues for years, and this is the first time they've been listened to. It's always quite shocking, really. And yeah, I mean, I've seen from personal experience, like discovery having quite a profoundly positive impact on like motivation within the team. We did a website redesign for a drug information service a few years back, and we had kind of the luxury of having a really a cross-functional team throughout the whole project. So we had back-end developers and front-end developers involved in discovery, so they were there with us learning about the stories of these people that were impacted by drugs, and all these stories about people like parents who had moved to the country and English was a second language, and their kids live in the city, and they're trying to like understand this landscape and the dangers they have, and it made when you say you work in UX, you say, oh, I've got empathy, that's one of the main traits you have. But this was, everybody really cared. It wasn't just about delivering to a bunch of requirements. It was, okay, this really matters what we're doing now. And it's not even just when it's something as impactful as drugs. It's like, if you're thinking about just visa applications, or even like if it's a service to apply for a taxi license, that's you start to learn that, okay, this is really important to people because it's someone's livelihood here. So it's, I think having those kind of real in-depth, those bringing those stories to life gives the entire team something to rally around, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that connection to like why we're doing things is so important to teams, and that connections to the users. Like, as you were kind of just saying there, Steve, like something that maybe does seem a bit dry can end up being quite motivational and like really tug on the heartstrings, because when you see people struggling with a problem, as designers, we're absolutely motivated to solve those problems for them. And when you are working with a team of folks who really care about the thing that they're delivering, it makes a massive difference to morale. And that, again, just has like that knock-on input down into like the outcomes that we achieve as a team on the project.
Yeah, it impacts morale and quality, right? Like you say,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we all want to make something better.
Yeah, because it's not just what we deliver, like it is how we deliver that thing as well. And if we're delivering something that's absolutely amazing, but at the sort of like the human cost of our team's health or mental health, that's not something to be proud of. But if you can do the two in tandem, that's always that's where we want to be.
And like, how many? Oh, sorry, Emily. Do you have time for a quick interjection?
Yeah, of course.
I was just thinking, like, how many big programs sometimes you go on to, and actually that meaning is completely lost, and you're just like looking at project milestones, and that becomes your drive. But actually, that context of like, why is this important, is so important to just rally the team and to kind of create that focus, and also make sure that you're making your decisions correctly, like that your decision making is delivering value, that you're not wasting money, like spending around stuff, or you're not wasting time and energy spinning on different directions.
And I think we're all talking about like examples of like discoveries ran well, or like positive discoveries where it's like you had said, Caroline, benefiting those we serve, benefiting the teams, and benefiting the organizations, like that kind of like trifecta. So I was wondering, just for the like, we want to leave some time to answer the questions that have been coming through the chat, and for those who are maybe have questions in their minds that they're wondering whether they should ask or not, now's your time to pop them in. I'm going to maybe just share a question for us all to reflect on while those questions are coming in, around the design of discoveries. So maybe from your experience of delivering discoveries in the past, designing them in the past, maybe selling them or working on with organizations to understand the value, I'm wondering whether you could share either what a valuable discovery has looked like, what those components are, or where they could be improved. So like, as people who have experiences across design, if you were to redesign a discovery format, like what would it look like? What would you add? What would you take away? So I'm going to open that to the floor. So whoever wants to come through first, please do.
I guess I'm going to give the consultant answer of it depends, right? It depends on what the question is, you know, that you need to answer for that discovery to be successful. I think I suppose one of the things that clients are keen on at the moment is about doing more with less at the moment, and not kind of repeating stuff. And I think there's a bit about kind of being better at maintaining the knowledge and the insight that you gather through discoveries. You know, and there's a bunch of tools coming out around this stuff. You know, Notion's been around a couple of years. You've got things like Dovetail and Airtable, and I think this is something we can be better at, so that, you know, when you do a discovery and you start with a discovery, you're starting from a really rich bank of insight, and so you know that you're actually focusing on where you need to focus to learn new things.
I think just continuing to bang the drum as well about, like, you know, who we're including. Sometimes actually within certain groups we're over researching certain communities, and that can be taxing on them, especially if we're, depending on how we're compensating them and you know, valuing them for their research or time, like using tools like Dovetail or Airtable or just like it improves research operations, can be really helpful to minimize that risk.
I think from my side, we can sometimes be guilty of overlooking where there is misalignment within an internal team and where maybe there are differences in shared vision. And I think that could be one thing that we really focus on, is actually spending longer and working harder to get that alignment, no matter what it takes, before agreeing whether we're ready to move on or not. And if there is that misalignment, then finding new ways to get that alignment. Yeah.
And just leading on from that, actually, one of the things I always find really valuable is working really closely with the clients. So bringing them on that journey with us. You know, it's less rewarding when you do a discovery and then just like big reveal, present the report. it's much more rewarding when you know you've taken the client on that journey and you know there's going to be a lasting impact there. It is going to go on to something else.
I think ensuring that that impact, because what's the point in doing a discovery if actually there's no impact? I think it's so important, right, to be able to bridge those steps. And actually, I think that's possibly combining a bunch of these reflections is if you do that discovery and there's no stakeholder alignment, then maybe that's not going to go to that next step. If your client, you haven't brought them along that journey and they don't have the same reflections as you, or same reflections throughout, will they be able to have that same confidence and through that? And I'm saying clients, I mean stakeholders or people that you're working with that maybe need to make some decisions. Yeah, I think there's something there. I think also we've been talking a lot about I think that Nicola, if you've not noticed it, Nicola had a really lovely phrase at the beginning where she described meaningful and proportionate research, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with Erica Hall's kind of essay on just enough research and having just enough research to be able to evidence and drive your decision making forward. But we talk about stop-go decision making and decision points about how do we know when we have enough to maybe just disband or stop doing something because actually what we've already learned that it's not going to be a goer. And I think sometimes, at least in my experience, sometimes we can get to a point and actually maybe have that feeling midway through the project, but because we're in that space, we're going to continue, we're going to document a report, we'll dot all the T's or dot all the I's and cross all the T's and make sure that it's all kind of packaged up, and actually maybe there's a way to drive more kind of research questions. I think at the beginning Steve talked about research questions being part of the driving force of your discovery. So maybe having those stage gates throughout your discovery where you can kind of say, well, do we have stakeholder alignment? Does everybody kind of see that this is an issue and bought into solving it? Or have we learned something really early on that kind of gives us a lot of clarity that this is not going to be viable to pursue this in any meaningful way. So having that confidence that you've understood the question and understood the problem space enough, and then that clarity on what the decision is, I think is really important. And how do you kind of stage that so it's not never ending?
Yeah, that kind of value, not volume, I think is coming across a lot, that not just getting stuck in that loop of discoveries, but being able to meaningfully move on with confidence, I think is super important. Cool, we've got plenty of time for questions, but we also have plenty of questions. So I'm going to get started and just go through the order. And just to remind you that if you want to use the thumbs up button to upvote any questions that are already there, I'm going to be running through kind of linearly. So that'd be the best way to get your question answered. But I think we've got enough time to move through them all. We touched on the first question a small bit, but I wanted to go back to it because it is the top voted question. From Rachel, what are your thoughts on mini discovery? I've tried one recently as a test and learn, and I'm concerned about the issues of bias that it might create. So maybe if folks want to just put their hand up, if you want to respond to that question, and then I can call on you. Yeah, Steve, do you want to go?
I mean, I've got thoughts. I don't think I have an answer, but I think there is bias in every bit of research you're ever going to do, right? Just by the fact that it's you analysing a piece of research, there are going to be inherent biases that you need to be aware of within that. And I think also we need to think about discoveries that are appropriate to the kind of project that we're doing. We're not I don't think anybody here is suggesting that all discoveries should be 6-month long massive pieces of work, right? That would be lovely, but actually by the time you've done it, actually the stuff you learn at the start might be out of date, right? So I think as a kind of test and learn, I think it's about what's appropriate, right, within the budget and the time constraints that you've got. But I think the fact that you're aware of those biases, because like I said, you're not going to be able to remove every single one, but kind of going into that kind of providing the insights with that caveat is always, I guess, quite helpful.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. I think being really clear on what the limitations were, and I think that idea of kind of making sure that the length of the discovery is again kind of proportionate to the size of the challenge. And if you're trying to apply a mini discovery to a really big problem, then that's going to lead to further issues down the line. So if you're constrained by budgets and time, then is there a way of breaking down the problem more and kind of making the scope of the discovery smaller to make that proportionate to the length of time that you've got, rather than trying to fit it the other way around, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. I hope that answers your question, and actually leads us nicely on to the next top voted question from Stan, which is around outsourcing discovery. So would outsourcing discovery be an option for those who are on tight budgets, like you mentioned, Nicola, tight budgets and tight timelines? And if so, what are the key things to consider? Who wants to come first on that one?
Like, I'm happy to talk to that one. So I think it really, like, you know, all of these things are contextual, right? So I think the things that you need to be considering are like how big and how entangled is the subject matter that you're trying to get people into? Is it a really complex problem that needs a lot of understanding and absorption to be able to meaningfully attack or attack, not attack, but interrogate? And I think, you know, do you have the skills in a team? Is that's another thing, I guess. Do you have the skills in house that you could do that realistically? And if not, you know, like Nicola had said, like, how could you potentially focus down the scope of your discovery so that it's meaningful within the budget and timeline that you have? I think, like, other things to consider, and I think this happens to us all, regardless of our organization, but external perspectives sometimes can be really helpful points of, like, pointing out a problem and realizing that it's a problem. Because sometimes this can be a real challenge internally to be able to kind of say, oh, we know this is a problem, and everybody's pointing at it being a problem, but actually, until somebody from the outside says that it's a problem, it can be often overlooked. So depending on the context, again, is that a helpful tool to help you mobilize this further? Is it helpful to use other people to kind of corroborate what you're looking at?
Yeah, and I would just add to that, and this probably sort of echoes something that Steve talked about earlier on, which is about, like, you know, in discoveries, we are really focused on what we've learned and what we've evidenced. But if you are facing those constraints and you know there's a gap there, this is also an opportunity to be super clear about what we don't know and the potential risk that might have downstream on your project. And I think those things are just as important as what we know when we're talking about making informed decisions.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I think we've got it covered. The next top voted question is from Famida. So I found discovery that occurs at the start of a project tends to go stale / out of date. So for discovery to stay relevant and not just confined to the start of a project, would it be worth revisiting at a later stage of the project to manage objectives found in the initial stages of discovery? Who wants to come forward on that one?
Yeah, I can. I think that's a really, really good point. And I think what that really highlights is how it's super important not to think of discovery as, oh, that's the user-centered bit. And then when you've done that, okay, we're just going to go off and do stuff. Actually, it's why, you know, when we're doing kind of discovery, alphas, betas, or, you know, all the way through to delivery, we're involving customers throughout that whole process. So we're never really kind of then stopping and going back and revisiting discovery. We're always just constantly into, you know, putting, oh, my cat's visiting now, there you go, that's helpful. We're constantly kind of putting what we're building in front of people, learning whether that, you know, all our assumptions that we, all our insights and our hypotheses that we tested in discovery, are they still true? And we're constantly feeding that insight back. So that's kind of how I would do it, is kind of keep it as a consistent thread throughout the process.
I was probably going to say pretty much the same thing, that often just keep, we think about research as a one-stop shop, but it's an iterative process. And I think that, like Rachel asked down below, you know, how do you balance that running out of steam, you know, whether that's people to test with, or you know, how do you not create super users just because they've become so well versed, where you're catching that Hawthorne effect of planting the seed and then solving the problem. I think, like, really depends on the scale of the service that you're doing in that. But I think the message for me is that needs to be iterative through the process. You constantly need to learn and be relevant to the questions that are coming up in the project.
Nicola, do you want a final word on that before we go to the next question?
Yeah, sorry, just very quickly was going to say that I think often discoveries do generate these sorts of living documents that are so important and useful for revisiting, whether it's user journeys or systems maps or impact maps that bring you back to the kind of core objective and the core purpose and the core clarity that you need as a team on where are we at, what have we changed, what haven't we changed, and why. So those living documents can be such a useful tool for making sure that discoveries don't go stale.
And you might want to stay off mute, Nicola, because I think the next one might be directed at you. So how could you explain an organization the benefit of doing an impact mapping step before they go any further with decision making?
I think the first question I'd ask is what is it that we're aiming towards, and are we as a team, as an organization, able to articulate that? And then the follow-up question is, okay, so how do we think we will get there? And again, if people are able to articulate those steps, then maybe you don't need to do an impact mapping process. But if it's harder to explain that murky middle ground of what do we expect those kind of intermediate outcomes to look like, what do we expect to happen in a year's time or 2 years' time, if that's unclear, then that's where the benefit really comes from doing it. Yeah, I think.
Cool, thank you. I'm going a bit quick fire because I want to make sure we get all the questions covered off. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'll read through it again in case anyone wants to add to it. From Rachel: doing your discovery is so helpful, but how do you balance running out of your steam and people to test with, or using the same cohort of people throughout Discovery Alpha Beta Live and risking them becoming almost expert users? TLDR, if you could only test at one stage, would it be Disco or later?
I'm going to assume you are as user research in that. I'm just going to check that acronym. I always do, but yeah, I guess the way we make sure users don't kind of run out of steam is we never use the same people more than once typically. So we would just invest more in a broader range of recruitment, and again, that's going to help with biases, and it's going to enable you to recruit from a broader pool of people. And even, we've done, recruit from people with different accessibility needs spread across the kind of the entirety of the project. So that's how I would tackle that. I would make sure I'm investing enough in kind of my recruitment to make sure I've got a good spread.
I was going to challenge, maybe though, sometimes, it's helpful to have expert users, right? We talk about people being able to meaningfully contribute to decisions. And, if we talk about co-design of services, and I appreciate we're stepping slightly away from discovery, particularly, sometimes actually having people really understanding the how the design process works and the stages that they're at and what the solution and constraints are is really helpful to be able to have them interpret it differently. And I guess if you have that small audience that maybe you're not able to recruit differently, maybe it's a way of can you shift your design approach that actually is less extractive and more collaborative.
Thank you. So kind of lots of different things to take away from there. The next question from Sam: the biggest problem for me is the agile way some organizations want to do discovery, where they want to do design and discover simultaneously. What ends up happening is they solutionize and then use discovery to validate their assumptions without challenging them. What are your thoughts on combining different frameworks and methodologies like Agile and Double Diamond and the impacts of those decisions? Someone want to come forward on that one? So I think to summarize, it's really like how do you avoid people using discovery as a vehicle to just bring a solution in, and that kind of like validate as opposed to like explore?
Sometimes that is unavoidable. Sometimes it's happened at the point in which you're coming in and you're facing into that problem. Steve touched on this earlier when we were talking about, you know, that real sort of temptation to look for an output as soon as possible rather than focusing on the outcome. And that is, yeah, it's a realistic problem that I think we probably all have faced into at some point. So obviously sort of trying to take your stakeholders through the benefits of discovery is going to help in that space. But if they've already done it and they already are committed to that, you kind of have to work within those constraints and understand, right, what can you do with that tech stack or those limitations, whatever it is that you're working within, to try and meet the needs of the users. And sometimes the solutions to the problems that you might be looking for are not going to be digital solutions. They might be more like, they might be in another channel, for example, or you might have to get a wee bit creative with how you meet the needs of that user where it's not dependent on that tech stack.
Also, I was going to add that that it's in order to kind of avoid, I suppose, sort of massaging the approach in order to achieve an outcome that you just wanted to achieve. It's about kind of really challenging ourselves and the sorts of questions that we're asking. Are we leaving enough space within how we're validating our assumptions to make sure that the answers we get will give us a realistic and accurate picture of how users feel? So that those questions are really, really key, I think, for that.
I think I think Emily, you had mentioned as well, this kind of, you know, depending on the stage of the project you're at, we can talk about generative research and evaluative research, and depending on the type of position you're in. And I think, Nicola, you're kind of pointing at this, is that actually maybe it's about switching your approach. Let's think, okay, well, if you're really facing that constraint from a senior stakeholder or from a cultural, well, let's talk about the senior stakeholder first, then actually that is the conversation is, okay, well, how can we switch our methods to evaluate the scenario and evaluate the hypothesis and get a clear answer while leaving room for that assumption to be misproven. I think if it's culturally, I think advocating then for that bias and kind of highlighting the risks of the biases that you're going to make, I think is really important, and kind of trying to create the space for generative research and open-ended hypothesis that can inform new directions or new opportunities that you might have been blinded to.
Yeah. If we're building services that are going to last and be sustainable, you might be in that context just now, but that doesn't mean you're always going to be in that context, or the service is always going to be in that context. So even if it's a constraint you're facing into now, you can be thinking forward into the future as to, like, well, how do we like reduce that risk or mitigate against this happening again?
We've got 2 more questions real quickly, so I'm going to ask maybe if one person could come forward to answer each one. We kind of touched on Babia's question earlier on in the session, but just to come back to it around pre-discovery. So is there something called pre-discovery which happens prior to starting a discovery? And if there is, then what would you call this phase? And I guess, like, to add on to that, what do the activities in a pre-discovery typically look like? So does someone want to come forward and speak to that question?
Happy to. I think within that phase, yeah, like often, to be honest, Babia, we also speak about pre-discovery and think we should have a better name for this. But I think the key thing is like clarity on the problem being, or the thing that's being addressed. You know, do we have real clarity on what we're trying to achieve? And then, you know, what are the constraints of the landscape or the service? Have we appropriately sized it? You know, because sometimes we could talk about like lots of big thing. I remember we worked with an agency or a government agency before around their tracking and reporting in their organization, and it just became this massive, like, you know, just kept extending across the whole organization. You know, we ended up trying to interview about 50 people, and it just became too big. And actually, what the services that we were trying to deliver, you know, I think you have to kind of think about those services in a verb-driven way. You know, what is it helping someone to achieve? And so I think in pre-discovery, getting some of those conversations out that are more conceptual, more theoretical, before you start providing your evidence against them, is just getting your questions correct at that point.
I'm gonna have to put us on stop at the moment, unfortunately. So apologies, Roy and Laurie. Those are excellent questions that just came through, but unfortunately we're running out of time, so we won't be able to do them the justice that they deserve. But I think this discussion has been so great. We've covered off a ton in the past hour. So just to really quickly summarize, we've reflected on some of those key costs of not doing a discovery, things like, you know, risking taking longer to make decisions, building the wrong thing, having teams who feel maybe directionless or having low morale, potentially even harming or excluding people who need to use a key service, and those services ultimately being less resilient than we want them to be. So really, I think when we think about going forward from this session and taking away with us tools to have those productive conversations with our team members, organizations, or anyone really around advocating for human-centered discoveries, I think that the things that show why it's worthwhile investing in are, you know, faster decision making, that confidence in what you're building, evidence-based decision making, reducing waste and risk, that team alignment that we were chatting about, especially when we bring in that impact mapping, building services with intention, and involving those who will be using those services from the start. And that then giving that sort of ripple effect into giving a sense of direction and purpose for the team and ultimately the organization that you're doing something meaningful. And then that going on to reduce harm. So I guess that clarity on the positive intent on what we want to achieve when we're doing our discoveries and having that human-centered and meaningful impact. So I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all the great questions that came through, and apologies again to Roy and Laurie for not getting to your questions. But I want to respect your time. So we're just coming up to a minute before we finish. So thanks again for spending all your valuable time with us today. And just a note that you'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording should you need it. Again, it could be a beneficial thing to share with folks who you might be having these conversations with in your team. And yeah, we're all on LinkedIn. If you want to follow up on any conversations as well, be more than happy to chat. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. So thank you so much. And thank you to the panel as well. My goodness, I didn't even say thank you to the panel for sharing their expertise. It's been so great to chat with you all.
Thanks, Emily, for wonderful
Emily.
facilitation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
See you later, folks.
Thanks, everyone.